Hi, my name is Ron James, and I'm with the Center for Ethical Business Cultures, and we'd like to welcome you in a public program really exploring the global water challenges and what's Minnesota businesses' responsibilities. What are the values and the risks and opportunities that present themselves to us? We're so glad you've taken time out of your busy schedules, students, faculty, members from the business community to be with us to do a deep dive into this topic. I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, but we essentially will hear from Peter Gleick, who will share his perspective. He'll then be joined by a couple of members from the business community that I will introduce later that will share their perceptions of business responsibilities in this area. But first, a word about the Center for Ethical Business Cultures, your host. We're glad to have you this afternoon. Our mission is pretty straightforward. We work with business leaders in helping them to build and sustain ethical and profitable business cultures. We do a lot of work inside the Opus College of Business, working with the next generation of leaders. We also engage with actual businesses and their leaders, helping them as they wrestle with key ethical dilemmas. We like to think we serve at the intersection of both thought and practice, really focused on helping organizations create and sustain ethical cultures, but also key really is about building principal leaders. When we think about principal leaders, we think about people who lead with three perspectives. First of all, they see their own personal careers as part of a step in fulfilling their destiny, their calling, their purpose as an individual. Secondly, these are individuals who see the corporation's role, yes, first and foremost to serve the shareholder, but beyond that, they seek meaning for their organizations to fulfill a higher purpose. To whom, and that's the third area, they focus on what's the role in society that the organization and the individual participates in. How do they ensure that there's common good and benefit to all? That's the space that the Center for Ethical Business Cultures operates in. We essentially serve both the business community as well as the academic community. With the business community, we sponsor programs such as this, and we're so grateful for key corporate sponsors that step in to help defray costs for events such as this. We're grateful today to recognize, as you saw in the scrolling, CHS, General Mills, and Liberty Diversified International, along with the Catherine B. Anderson Fund. Our center also engages with organizations as they wrestle with the dilemmas in building and sustaining ethical cultures, and we engage in research to look at emerging issues. Finally, we like to engage with the next generation of leaders. To give you a quick snapshot as to how that shows up inside the work that we do on a day-by-day basis, from a research standpoint, we have several projects underway. With so much talk about risk management these days inside of organizations, we're looking at the intersection of ethics and ethical culture and risk management. How do you make sure you've embedded the right values inside of an organization so people understand what's its risk tolerance? We're looking at projects that examine ethics in emerging economies, and as their economic strength grows, who gets to determine the ethical standards that the world will govern its interactions by? Those are just a couple of examples. We work with the next generation of students. We recently held the Center for Ethical Business Cultures Ethics Case Competition, and just last week, the winners from that competition competed in the International Business Ethics Case Competition, and we're pleased to say they placed first in one division and second in a couple of other areas. The center offers services, as I mentioned, which include programs such as the one we are offering today. Please join us if your schedule permits on May 13th, where we will be co-hosting the 16th Annual Minnesota Business Ethics Awards, where we recognize organizations that build and sustain an ethical culture. We do videos, and incidentally, this program will be videoed and it'll be available on our website for your review at your leisure, both a shortened version as well as the full-length version. Well, enough about the center and who it is and what it is we actually do. I'd like to get our program started by introducing our speaker. Our format will be pretty straightforward. our speaker will come to us and share some of his insights about some of the global challenges of water and what are businesses' responsibilities. Following that, we'll be joined by a couple of panelists that I'll introduce when they come up from the business community, and they'll give you their perspectives about businesses' role in addressing ethical challenges as it relates to water. We'll have a conversation among ourselves, and then we'll open it up to the audience, where we'll invite your questions so that we get at the things that are on your mind. But now, our speaker is Peter Gleick. Peter is the president and co-founder of the Pacific Institute, based in Oakland, California. It's a think tank that was established in 1987 that works in the fields of water, economic and environmental justice, and sustainability. Peter has led the organization in doing a lot of analysis about the impacts of climate change on water. The earliest and most comprehensive work came from his institute, looking at water and conflicts around the world that are arising. He has worked hard on helping to define both the basic human need and right to water that's been used by the United Nations. He is a noted author and scholar, and he's received the most prestigious MacArthur Genius Fellowship. He's been elected an academic leader in the International Academy in Oslo, Norway, and in the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Peter Gleick.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Ron James. Thank you to the Center for inviting me, and to the staff who helped organize this. I'm delighted to be here. I've been asked to provide a little bit of context about the enormous issue around fresh water and some of the challenges that face us today. I'm going to do that very quickly, a bit of a drink from a fire hose, if you will, and I'll try not to have too many water-related puns, but in my business there are a lot of them. I'm going to talk about global and local water challenges, some of the problems that face us. I'm going to talk about water in the corporate sector, and business social responsibility. I'm going to talk about the human right to water and work of the United Nations. And I'll close with some comments about solutions to some of the big challenges that face us. Each one of these topics could be a long talk in and of themselves, so I'm going to go fairly quickly, and I will not do this topic justice, but for those of you interested in it, it might give you some sense of some of the challenges, some of the issues, some of the things you might want to pursue in more detail. The key point, I guess, is that water connects to everything. If you're interested in energy or food or forests or ecosystems or industrial production or climate change, water is part of all of those things. It's one of the reasons why we at the Institute focus on water issues, because it's so connected to everything. It's hard to think about a global environmental problem or a social or an economic problem that isn't to some degree related to fresh water resources. A little bit of context, just to give you some sense of the challenges that face us. There are 2.5 billion people worldwide that don't have access to safe drinking water, to adequate sanitation, and probably 700 million that don't have access to safe drinking water. There's still, as a result of the failure to meet that basic human need for water, millions of preventable water-related deaths every year. The diseases that we in the industrialized world got rid of 100 years ago, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We have water quality problems, old ones and new ones. Old ones associated with human wastes, new ones associated with new kinds of industrial contaminants. And we've made progress at dealing with water quality issues in some places, at some time, but not extensively. And there are new water quality challenges that we are not adequately addressing. Ecosystems are deteriorating because the water that humans use comes out of natural ecosystems. It used to be that ecosystems used all of the water. And as human populations have grown, and population is a big driver in this debate, as populations have grown, as our demand for water has grown, our extraction of water from natural ecosystems has grown, and more ecosystems are suffering from that use of water. Conflicts over water are growing, and I'll come back to this one as well. in the literal sense of violent conflicts over water, but there are political conflicts, there are economic conflicts, there are social and community conflicts, there are industry sector conflicts over water, and that's a challenge. And the climate's changing. And the climate is the hydrologic cycle. The hydrologic cycle that you all remember from second grade, of course. That is evaporation, the formation of clouds, condensation, precipitation, runoff, back to evaporation. The hydrologic cycle is the climate cycle, and I'll come back to that issue as well. So a quick reminder of the importance of a modern industrial world water system. In the old days, water-related diseases were rampant. People didn't drink water if they could drink something else. There's a remarkable story about some of the earliest colonists coming to the east coast of the United States, really in the 1600s, and they landed, and there was an immediate crisis because they were running out of water. They were running out of things to drink on the ship, and the things to drink on the ship were boiled things. They were mostly low-alcohol beer, and they didn't know what to do. And they were in an ecosystem that provided them with unlimited quantities of fresh water. And they didn't understand, because they didn't come from a civilization where you could do this, that you could drink water from the rivers. And they had to figure out what to do about that. This is an old, I don't remember the year, 1912, I guess, about cholera sweeping over Europe. Sweeping over the Americas. Cholera killed hundreds of thousands of people in Europe, in the United States, before we figured out how to put in place a modern industrial water treatment system. And in fact, this is a graph that shows for the city of Philadelphia from 1887 up to about 1940, the incidence of typhoid deaths in the city of Philadelphia. And it's typhoid deaths per 100,000 population. And as you can see, typhoid was very prevalent until the introduction of water treatment. In 1909, the first water treatment systems were introduced in New Jersey with filtration and then chlorination. And typhoid deaths and cholera deaths and illnesses basically dropped to zero in the industrialized world when modern water treatment systems were put in place. And this is what's still lacking in much of the rest of the world. This is still the millions of unnecessary deaths from water-related diseases around the world. But in addition to these old challenges that we've not fully solved worldwide, there are some new ones. Challenges around energy and water, around food and water. There's something called the energy-water nexus, or the energy-food-water nexus. I'll talk a little bit about those issues. The issue of climate change, the issue of water and conflict and international security, and this question about business risks, and I'll touch in a little more detail about each of these. On energy and water are very tightly connected, but the links among those issues, energy, water, and food, are poorly understood and rarely addressed in policy. And decision makers and corporations and communities need to think about these issues more closely together if we're going to make proper policy decisions. It takes a tremendous amount of water to produce energy. The energy system in the United States and the industrialized world in general is very water intensive, primarily water for cooling. 30 or 40% of all of the water withdrawn in the United States goes to cool power plants, primarily fossil fuel power plants, fossil fuel and nuclear power plants that are thermally driven. They require a lot of water for cooling. And we've already seen in places around the United States during drought, when water is scarce or when temperatures are rising, limits on power production. And yet we don't tend to think about energy and water policy together very well. Conversely, it takes a tremendous amount of energy to produce water, to collect the water that we need, to treat it to the standards that we demand, to deliver it to our homes, to use it in your homes. A tremendous amount of your energy bill at home actually goes to heat water, to collect wastewater, to treat that wastewater. That's an energy-intensive system as well, and another connection between energy and water. And the failure to link these two issues together, I argue, will inevitably lead to disruptions in both of those things. We've seen in the energy sector disruptions already. We're going to see more. We're going to see challenges in the water supply system as well when energy becomes more and more expensive, and as we're already seeing. One other piece of this puzzle, just a quick one. This is the Energy Information Agency's projection for the production of natural gas in the United States. Basically, this big bar projection after 2010 is shale gas. It's the fracking debate. And part of the fracking debate is if we're going to expand natural gas production in the United States, which many argue we need to do. It's cleaner than coal from a climate perspective. It's independent of the politics of importing oil from the Middle East. And so many people argue we need to expand natural gas production and use in the US. It's going to come from shale gas. And associated with fracking are a whole series of water-related challenges. The water requirements for fracking, threats to groundwater from the process itself, contamination associated with the produced water that comes up with shale gas and has to be disposed of. There are a whole series of water-related issues with that energy decision. And it's a big part of the fracking debate right now. On food, I mentioned this already, but 80% of the water that is used worldwide by humans goes to food production, irrigated agriculture primarily. It's the biggest demand of society for water. And in the United States, 80% of the water that's consumed goes to the agricultural sector. And in California, 80% of the water that we use in California goes to irrigated agriculture. It's a pretty consistent statistic. And there are a whole series of challenges associated with that. How sustainable is that water supply? Where's the water going to come from to satisfy not today's population of 7 billion, but tomorrow's 8 or 9 or 10 billion? That's a water question as much as it's a question about land and the productivity of the kinds of crops we grow. So that's another piece of the water and food puzzle. But here's another one. In the water world, we've been talking increasingly in the last few years about something called virtual water. Very simply, the idea here is that there is water embedded in the goods and services we produce. It takes water to grow food. It takes water to make semiconductors. When you move food from one part of the world to another, you're not moving water, but you're moving virtual water. It's actually a lot cheaper to move the grain than to move the water itself. Just to give you a specific example of that, it takes 1,000 tons of water, typically, to produce a ton of grain. So you don't want to move the water, you want to move the grain. It's a much higher valued product. Water is very heavy. So we grow food and we move it around the world. We grow semiconductors and computers and we move them around the world. And there's water embedded in those decisions. There's water embedded in the trade of goods and services around the world. And this is a graph that shows that virtual trade of water. The countries that are in green are exporters, net exporters of water. So the United States is a net exporter of water. We're a major food producer for the world, and we export a lot of that food, and that's a net export of water. We're also a net importer of all sorts of things, and there's water embedded in that as well. The countries that, it's a little hard for me to see the colors and see how good they are, but the colors that are redder or orange or yellow, that are supposed to be red or orange or yellow, are net importers of water. And that's become a policy question. Should we be exporting water? What are the implications for regions that are water short but are exporters of water, like California, like Australia? There's been a big debate in California. We export a very substantial amount of water in alfalfa to China. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's the way the markets work. There's an economic value to the producers of alfalfa and the exporters of alfalfa and the importers in China who purchase that. But that's a net export of water. It turns out California imports more water from China than we export. That sometimes gets lost in the conversation. But that's part of the discussion about water policy worldwide. And it's related to some of this question about business investment in water-related activities. Part of that debate is also about meat. Alfalfa goes to grow cows. I said it takes 1,000 tons of water to grow a ton of grain. It takes about 16,000 tons of water to grow a ton of cow, because you're growing grain and you're feeding the grain to the cow. Meat-heavy diets are more water-intensive, and this raises the question about all of our personal responsibilities about our own water footprint, about our decisions about the goods and services that we consume that have a water implication. A water-intensive diet, a meat-intensive diet is a water-intensive diet, and it raises questions about that piece of the food puzzle. And you can see on a per capita basis, this is a map that shows meat consumption per capita in kilograms per person. The redder the country, the more meat intensive the diet. But I would also note that this is changing over time. This is China. The units are millions of tons of meat. It's not per capita. China is a very large population. They still consume far less meat per person than do we in Western Europe or in the United States or in Canada. But it's growing very rapidly. As their economy grows, as their economic wealth increases, their consumption of meat is going up. Interestingly, the consumption of meat in North America seems to have peaked, and maybe it's going down a little bit. Not that all of us could perhaps eat a little less meat in our diets. But that's a water question, as well as a question about diet and health and all of the other issues associated with that. There's lots more I could talk about food too, but just to give you a little bit of a taste of what this is all about. These aren't intentional, I promise. So water and climate. I mentioned the hydrologic cycle is the climate cycle, but just to put this in again into a little bit of context, this is a graph of 800,000 years of atmospheric carbon dioxide, measured through ice core research, mostly in Antarctica, and it shows a number of different things. The units are concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in parts per million. The 800,000 years ago is over here up until the present, which is right here. And it shows a couple of things. It shows ups and downs. Carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere naturally, long before humans existed, which started somewhere around here, went up and down. When the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere was high, temperatures on the planet were warmer. That's the greenhouse effect. It's the natural greenhouse effect. And when they were high, these periods here are what are called interglacial periods, relatively warm periods. When CO2 levels were low, on the order of 180 parts per million in the atmosphere, we were in an ice age. We, the planet, was in an ice age. The difference between an ice age and an interglacial, a warm period, was 50 or 60 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Not a big deal, not a lot of change. So these are natural fluctuations, and they have to do with climate dynamics and orbital dynamics and the tilt of the Earth. I won't get into what changes climate naturally. The atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide in 1850, when we really started with a vengeance burning fossil fuels, was about 280 parts per million. That's considered the natural pre-industrial level of CO2, 280 parts per million, which was right here. This year we're at 400. We passed 400 and we're not going back down. This increase, this is where we are now, this is the Industrial Revolution. This is the combustion of fossil fuels, primarily. And this is the climate change problem. This is why atmospheric scientists are worried about climate change. And associated with that problem is the issue of temperature. Temperature is only one piece of the climate change puzzle. We're going to change a lot more than temperature, but this is a graph that shows global land and ocean temperature anomalies, that is, changes from the average over the last century, from 1880 to 2014. And it shows the rising temperatures of the globe. This is also the climate change problem. And this is not natural. This is human-induced, is the consensus in the scientific community. But we worry about more than temperature. We worry about extreme events. This is actually a satellite photo of Hurricane Sandy. If you look closely, you can sort of see New Jersey here. Here's Long Island. New York City's right there. Hurricane Sandy was an extreme event. It was not caused by climate change. No climate scientist makes that argument. But it was influenced by climate change. I'm making that argument. It was influenced by climate change for two reasons. One is sea surface temperatures are warmer now than they've been, and they're warmer now because the Earth is warming up because of increased CO2 concentrations. And the strength of hurricanes is a function of sea surface temperature. Hurricanes get their strength from the warm surface layers of the ocean. But this was also a factor because sea level is 9 inches higher today than it was 150 years ago, because one of the implications of climate change is rising sea levels. And Hurricane Sandy happened to hit New York at the highest high tide. And that tide was 9 inches higher than it would otherwise have been without climate change. And so some fraction of the damage associated with Hurricane Sandy is attributable to human-induced climate change. And so we're seeing these growing influences of climate change on extreme events. And it's an exciting part of the climate science debate right now, but it's a worrisome challenge going forward. And I would note that the insurance industry, which pays careful attention to risk, has concluded, quote, "The only plausible explanation for the rise in weather-related catastrophes is climate change." They look at the science, they look at risk, they look at statistics, and they're worried. And this is just a graph that shows for a series of natural catastrophes in North America, the total number of catastrophes growing over time, not an economic valuation, simply the number of events, of extreme events, dominated by meteorological and hydrological and climatological events over time. And I like to argue that if climate change is a shark, water resources are the teeth. The water resources is where a lot of the bite is going to come in terms of water availability and water quality and extreme storms and drought frequency and intensity. And we're having a big debate about this right now in California. We're now in the 4th year of an extreme drought that is influenced by climate change. Not only have the last 4 years been the driest 4 years in a row in the historical record, they've been the hottest. It's not just a dry drought, it's a hot drought. And we've built a massive water infrastructure. Water treatment systems, wastewater disposal plants at sea level, groundwater systems, aqueducts, dams, and reservoirs that were built under the assumption that tomorrow's climate's going to be the same as yesterday's climate. They were built for a certain climate. And if there's anything we know now, it's that that assumption is no longer valid. And we have to think about how to manage the infrastructure we have or to modify that infrastructure for the changes that we think are coming. Conflict over water. We do a lot of work at the Pacific Institute on conflicts over water. One of the things we maintain on one of our websites is called the Water Conflict Chronology. If you're interested in history of these kinds of things, Google Water Conflict Chronology and you'll find it. This is a Google map that shows all of the events that we've mapped going back 4,000 years associated with violent conflict over water, where water was a target of conflict in the sense of I want your water and I'm coming to get it, or water was a weapon during a war or a conflict that started for another reason, or water resource systems were targets during conflict, or water itself was a tool used during conflicts. Each one of these is an example. And unfortunately, the risk of conflicts over water seems to be growing. This is a graph that shows the number of conflicts over time, just from 1930 up until the present, 2013 in this case, showing the total number of conflicts over time. I think part of this is a reporting anomaly. I think we're just getting better at seeing and recording these kinds of conflicts. But there is more tension over water resources, over access to water, especially in Northern Africa and the Middle East, but in other parts of the world as well. And I could, again, talk extensively about that, but I'm going to move on. Let me talk about business and the corporate sector briefly. Water is obviously a fundamental component for the corporate sector. Water is an input. The things that we produce, that all of us consume, require water. Food products, but not just food products. It takes water to make semiconductors. It takes water to make clothing. It takes water to make almost everything. And so water itself is an input. It's historically been a pretty low cost input. It's been an input that most businesses for a long time have taken for granted. But I would argue that's no longer the case. And it's an input both in a direct sense and in a supply chain sense. And maybe in the conversation we can talk about some of the supply chain issues as part of this debate. Water is a key business strategy for some sectors of the corporate world. Water utilities, bottled water companies, water management companies, where water is actually the business that they operate. And water is a risk to businesses. And in particular, some of the work we've done at the Pacific Institute has identified, and we have a series of publications on this, 3 ways of thinking about water as a risk. Actually, before I show you that, the World Economic Forum, which many of you may be familiar with, which is a collection of sort of the high-end water executives that meet regularly to talk about business in the world, in the global context, has spent some time thinking about risks that face the business community and the economic systems around the world. This is a little hard to read, but they've categorized a whole series of risks from impact, from low impact to high impact, and likelihood from low likelihood to high likelihood. And here we have pandemics and cyber attacks and interstate conflict and corruption and organized crime and water, way up at the top, associated with financial crises, climate change, underemployment and unemployment. Water is increasingly being perceived as a major risk. What kind of a risk? There's physical risk, that is the inability simply to get the amount or the quality of water that's required to do a business, to do something. Increasingly, water scarcity and water quality challenges present physical risks to the corporate sector. There's reputational risk, which is public perception around decisions that businesses make and around operations that have to do with the way businesses work with local communities, that have to do with whether or not businesses are being socially responsible. And more social responsibility is a fundamental part of business operations. The day when businesses could only put out a financial report are over. They all put out sustainability reports now. And again, we'll hear much more about that in the Q&A. We have some people responsible for thinking about sustainability from a business perspective. And the corporations that are forward-thinking think about reputational risk as a part of this challenge. And there's regulatory risk. Businesses, individuals, all of us, we live in a regulatory environment. Governments provide structure. They impose rules and laws. Some governments restrict water use. Governments license water use in many parts of the world in different ways, or the quality of water that companies can discharge, and they monitor and enforce those kinds of regulations. They may give or take back water rights. They play a role in infrastructure development. So all of these ways of thinking about risk, and there are others as well, play a role in the corporate sector now in thinking about water. So what is water corporate stewardship? And I put this up to show you an example of a PowerPoint that you should never put up, with lots of words. And I'm not going to read it, but I wanted it up there so I could read parts of it, so that you understand some of the nature of what water stewardship is. And this is actually another good example. If any of you have ever been involved in strategic planning or trying to write a mission statement, it's a difficult process. People fight about words and so on, and this is a ridiculous example of a mission statement. But it's also an indication of how complicated this issue is. But setting that aside, the first part of this is corporate water stewardship is the use of water that's socially equitable, so the issue of equity is important, environmentally sustainable, so the issue of environmental quality is an important part of this, and economically beneficial, because this is associated with economics and financial productivity, achieved through stakeholder-inclusive processes, not shareholder only, stakeholder. It's a broader community that we have to think about than sometimes businesses 50 years ago or 30 years ago, or sometimes today think about. Good water stewards understand their own water use, measurement, and reporting. Catchment context, what's going on in the local water basin where they operate. And shared risk, this issue of a broader concept of risk. And engage in meaningful individual and collective action. Companies that participate with local communities, that are transparent, that engage in conversation with their broad stakeholders are much more likely to be good water stewards. So it's wordy, but it's wordy because these are complicated issues. And then there are different ways to think about what is a good corporation, how does a good corporation implement these kinds of things? So you commit to doing something in the water stewardship area. You gather and understand information, that's data collection and analysis. You plan, you integrate this into your long-term plans. You implement those plans. You evaluate the consequences and you communicate and disclose. So there's a transparency component to this. And then you do it again. That's one way of thinking about corporate water stewardship. And there are lots of, again, moving parts to this. We work at the Pacific Institute very closely with something called the UN CEO Water Mandate, which is part of the UN Global Compact. The Global Compact is 5,000 corporations working with the UN on sustainability issues. The CEO Water Mandate is the water subset of that. It's a set of corporations and international environmental groups and the UN agencies thinking about these issues around sustainability. There's the Water Action Hub, which is, again, a multi-organization effort to try and bring together NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, major corporations, the United Nations, international aid organizations, to work on specific projects in specific regions around the world. Another example of one of the ways of engaging in this process. And there's the URL for the Water Action Hub. Water and human rights. Water is more than an economic good. Water is a human right. This was first raised in the first UN Water Conference in 1977 when they issued a statement that said, quote, "All peoples have the right to have access to drinking water in quantities and of a quality," not just quantity, but quality, "equal to their basic needs." That was the first official statement at a water conference about water as a human right. In '92, the Dublin Water Conference stated, "It's vital to recognize first the basic right of all human beings to have access to clean water and sanitation." For the first time, they added sanitation at an affordable price. Economics. So, right to water, quantity, quality, economics, price, equity. And the debate about whether or not there was a legal human right to water went on for a long, long time. But in July 2010, the UN passed a binding resolution stating that the human right to safe drinking water and sanitation is derived from the right to an adequate standard of living and inextricably related to the right of the highest attainable standards of physical and mental health, as well as the right to life and human dignity. They tied the right to water with other human rights that the UN had formally acknowledged. And now the conversation is, what does that really mean? What are the responsibility of governments? And this is primarily a responsibility of governments and local communities to meet this right, to progressively move forward and provide water and sanitation for the population that doesn't have it at the moment. And there's an ongoing parallel conversation about what this means for corporations. What's the role of the corporation in this context of the human right to water and this question of water as an economic good? So finally, let me talk a little bit about solutions. Very quickly. The good news is that there are a lot of solutions to our water problems. I think we're moving in the right direction. And I believe inevitably we're going to move to a world of sustainable water management and use. It might take a long time. The question is how much pain and suffering are we and others going to go through while we get there? But I do think that the path to a sustainable water future is apparent. I think we have to rethink the concept of supply. We're increasingly running out of new water. There's no new water in the Western US. We use it all. To some degree, we use more than we ought to already, and there's a debate about putting some of it back in the system. We're at what we call peak water in many parts of the world. And the idea of building another reservoir, tapping another river, drilling more groundwater wells, that's what we did in the 20th century, and it brought enormous benefits. But there are limits to the amount of water on the planet. We have to rethink new supply. But there are new supply options. And just to throw out two, we collect and treat an enormous amount of wastewater, and we throw it away. We treat it to a pretty high standard required by federal law in the US and state law, and then we throw it away. Sometimes somebody downstream reuses it. In California, we throw it in the ocean. That is an asset, not a liability. We have to start thinking about wastewater treatment plants, not as wastewater treatment plants, but as water recovery plants. That's a valuable resource. And in California, we're expanding our use of treated wastewater for all sorts of things, up to potentially and including potable water. We can treat any quality of water to potable standards, and we're moving in that direction. That's a new source of supply. Desalination. 97% of the world's water is salt water. It's too salty to drink or to grow crops with. We know how to desalinate water, and I'm not a huge fan of desalination. It's really expensive at the moment. But when we have no other options, when we've done the smart conservation and efficiency, when we've expanded our treated wastewater reuse, when we're growing our agricultural crops as efficiently as we can, we should look to the next more expensive options. And there are places around the world where desalination now makes sense. That's another potential source of supply at a cost. But we also have to rethink the concept of demand. And I've hinted at this a little bit, but the truth is we take out a tremendous amount of water from our systems and we use it incredibly inefficiently in almost all end uses. And the idea here, very simply, is that we can do the things we want with less water. We can grow more food with less water by moving from flood irrigation to sprinklers, or sprinklers to drip, or more carefully monitoring soil moisture and only watering crops when they need it, rather than on a random 16-day cycle, which is what we do in parts of California. That's a question of efficiency. We can wash our clothes with efficient washing machines. We can flush our toilets with efficient toilets. And we're moving in that direction. I will admit, my shower this morning was a little longer than it would have been if I was in California. So thank you. But the shower head I was using was not a low-flow shower head, just to let you know. And maybe it doesn't need to be here, although Minnesota is in a drought as well, I understand. So I would argue there's no place that couldn't rethink the way they use water and use water more efficiently. We have to protect water quality and match the quality of the water we have with the quality of the water we need. So to go back to toilets for a minute, I'm sorry, but why do we flush our toilets with potable drinking water? We do that because we have one set of pipes that come into our house. That's the way we developed our system. But if we were in a water-short world and we were redesigning that system, that's not what we would do. We would have a lower quality of water that irrigated our lawns and our medians and flushed our toilets and cooled industrial processes. So let's match the quality of the water we have with the quality we need. And in fact, there are lots of gains to be made from doing that. Let's use smarter economic tools. Pricing. Proper pricing for water is a really valuable tool. Water's a human right. It's an economic good. We have to balance equity issues with pricing. But most of us should be paying more for the water we get than we pay now, or I would argue for the water services that we get. We have to protect ecosystems. It might have been okay in the 20th century, it wasn't okay, but we didn't know better, to take all the water we want from ecosystems and ignore ecosystems. But it's the 21st century, and we know that it's not okay. We know that ecosystems are suffering from human withdrawals of water, and we have to figure out how to do what we want and yet protect the ecosystems that we also depend upon. And that's got to be part of a 21st century water solution as well. And finally, we have to rethink water institutions and management and public participation and so on. Basically, we have a 21st century water situation that we're trying to manage with 19th century infrastructure and 20th century institutions, and it isn't working really well. We need a 21st century set of infrastructure with a 21st century set of institutions, and there are gains to be made from all of these components of a soft path for water. So final thoughts. The water problem is real and it's bad. There are human, economic, and environmental costs to not doing something about it. Not everything is getting worse. There's lots of good news out there. There's lots of innovative technologies and institutions and projects and corporations and you name it out there, and we need to learn from the best. But we need some new thinking. What solutions are sustainable? What can be scaled? What's socially responsible? Let's think about new technologies, but think about economics also in the context of human rights. Let's think about smarter institutions. And new actions, commitments, and partnerships will move us in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you very much for those great and insightful comments about some of the challenges of water globally. You've really laid the foundation for us to have a great and stimulating conversation. What I'd like to do at this point is invite our other panelists to please come up and join us at the tables. As they're coming up, I'll introduce them as well. The format will be then that we'll start a conversation with a few questions that several of you have prepared for us in advance, and then we're going to open it up to other questions that you all might have. So please make sure that those are ready. We'll have a couple of microphones that will walk through the audience to give you a chance to ask your questions. First of all, on your far left is Jerry Lynch. Jerry is Vice President and Sustainability Officer for General Mills. He has an extensive background in brand management, general management, and sustainability. He really sees sustainability as integral to the business's environmental, business decision-making, and operational responsibilities. He does extensive work with non-governmental organizations, including the Nature Conservancy, where he worked to help complete a global water risk assessment in General Mills' growing regions and plants. Jerry volunteers his time extensively as well. He's on the advisory board of the Raptor Center of Minnesota, the Food Recovery Network, and the Board of Trustees at the Keystone Center. You've already met Peter. To Peter's left and is Emilio Tenuta. Emilio is Vice President of Corporate Sustainability for Ecolab. He works on linking market strategy with the sustainability solutions that Ecolab delivers through its partnerships with more than 1.3 million customers in 170 countries. He has a background that includes working in technical and marketing management. He has worked in a number of industries, including food and beverage, pharmaceutical, lodging, healthcare, primary metals, and the automotive space. He currently sits on the National Restaurant Association's Conserve Sustainability Advisory Board. He is heavily engaged with Net Impact and a sustainability work group for the World Travel and Tourism Council. He also has formed strong partnerships with NGOs, including the World Wildlife Fund, Alliance for Water Stewardship, the UN CEO Water Mandate, Nature Conservancy, and the World Economic Forum. Please join me in welcoming our panelists this afternoon as well, please. Well, thanks again, everybody, for being available. Maybe we can open it up, and Jerry, you might start us out, and please join in, Emilio, just reflections on Peter's comments. Is there something that resonated with you, something that maybe you might have a different point of view on? Would you please start us, Jerry?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks, Peter. It was a very helpful setting of the context, and a lot of information boiled down into the most salient points. And I think Peter's nailed it. We would agree with everything that you have to say. A couple of things really struck me. One is this water really is embedded in everything, and there really is a need for everybody to have that access in order to conduct life. I mean, it's essential to life as we know it. And as we look at it, we think about it not only in terms of what we need to produce, and we can talk a lot more about food and the demand for water in food, but we have an equal interest in our consumers having the water that they need, that the communities that we serve having the water that they need. And so it really does, any solution needs to be a multiplayer solution that everybody can win at. The other thing that struck me is just your comments about rising food demand and 2 billion new consumers globally coming into the world in the next 40 to 50 years, maybe more than that. Equally as important, the move of consumers from lower income brackets to middle income brackets. There'll probably be 3 billion new middle income consumers around the world. And the very first thing that they do when they get a little bit more money is they eat better, which in their minds typically is moving from a grain or plant-based diet to an animal protein-based diet. That pound of beef that you and I might have grilled this past weekend took 20 to 30 pounds of grain to grow. So if you're moving from a plant-based diet to an animal protein-based diet, you've all of a sudden accelerated demand for all those natural resources, specifically water and all the embedded water that's there. And so it really is a challenge and an opportunity for those of us who live in those dark red countries to transition to a more plant-based diet, and there's lots of opportunities. So those were the two that I think that resonated particularly with me.
Okay. Emilio, please share with us as well, too.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I'll just pick up where Jerry left off and say something that we all could relate to in terms of how material water is to us. So no water, no beer. So that burger on the weekend won't have a very cold beverage that we all like to enjoy on the weekend. So, and the reason I bring that up is because I think it's important, based on Peter's comments, in terms of the intersect of business and the impact that business has in the world of water conservation, water management, water stewardship. And so this concept of why hasn't more been done to this point is a very important question, because it really boils down to the fact that water is undervalued in much of the world. And so, great example of that, if you think of a place like Amsterdam right now, water in prices in Amsterdam are about $3.42 per cubic meter in what is considered a very low stress, water stress area. If you look at Mumbai, India, water is priced at 28 cents per cubic meter. Highly stressed area where water is not readily available. So there's this inverse relationship between water availability and what users pay for water, which obviously makes a significant impact in terms of the investment and the work to drive water reduction strategies to use less, which becomes an issue and has continued to be an issue and until now in some of the areas that Peter brought up, like California, where we're starting to see some of these risks that he talked about, such as regulations starting to take hold and that prices are starting to increase, and in some cases, other regulations take hold that minimize the amount of water that you can actually use. So that's one that really kind of stood out for me.
Well, maybe you could continue, Emilio, and just help us understand, why is this a business issue? What's the business responsibility in this debate and discussion?
So great question. I really believe when Peter spoke about this concept of stewardship and the fact that we as business organizations, private sector, have done a lot of work over the last 5 to 10 years around driving conservation, which is great, and we need to continue to do that, and we need more of it. But now, to Peter's point about these risks around stewardship and some of the things that the CEO Water Mandate is striving to do with the private sector, which is thinking more broadly about the issue, not just within the fences of the facilities that we operate, but also outside the fences and the impact it has in the basin. Because we know, as you heard, that water is a shared resource. So most likely we're going to be sharing it with a community and other stakeholders that depend on it. And so how do we all do our part to try to drive that mindset, which is important, which says that as a company, we start to do more around building that collective action, some of the things that General Mills has done in California, for instance. That is really, I see as where we're headed and where we're moving to.
Sure. Jerry, please share.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I was struck by Peter's description of a water management strategy and cycle. We use something very similar. So we have a 4-phase process that we use at looking at this as a food company. We're a small food company. We sell about $20 billion worth of food every year. So this is a little bit on our mind.
How much?
20 billion. So one of the things that we've done is to understand our water footprint. So the very first thing we did was we did a value chain wide water footprint, seed to landfill, not just within our 4 walls. What we discovered is that 99% of our water footprint in that value chain is upstream of us in our raw materials, mostly in food ingredients, a little bit in packaging, but mostly in food ingredients. That informs the conversation. Then the second thing that we did was working with the Nature Conservancy. We said, here are 85 watersheds around the world that are really important to us, either because we source a lot of raw materials out of them and or because we have facilities in them. Help us understand how risky these watersheds are. So they ranked them for us, and we've published that. We then said the 8 most risky, we're going to start doing work in over the next 5 years and get to a place where we can see how that watershed can become more sustainable. So that's the next 3 phases. We do a deep dive analysis of that watershed to get a much better picture of what the nature of the watershed is, because every watershed has its own unique challenges, risks, and opportunities to it. So we completed one in Irapuato, Mexico several years ago. We grow vegetables down there for the Green Giant brand. What the Nature Conservancy told us is that if you look out over the next 50 years and you include climate change and you look at the water that's in the watershed, the amount that's going out, and you overlay climate change on top of that, within 20 years, that watershed is going to be seriously risky to run agricultural operations in, because farmers will have to be drilling so deep, they're going to be pulling up the quality of water that will no longer help their crops, they'll hurt their crops, right? So we've got a 20-year window. So that's phase 2. Phase 3 then is develop a strategy and collaborate. In that watershed, we are 0.2% of the water usage in that watershed. If we fixed ourselves, if we became totally water neutral by some magic of nature, it would not make any difference in that watershed. That watershed would still have problems. So the whole watershed has to change. And so we're now in the process of clarifying the strategies that will make a difference and pulling together multiple stakeholders, communities, NGOs, farmer groups, other industry players, to change the trajectory of that watershed, to put together a stewardship plan. And in the fourth phase, which is so great about Peter's cycle, is to then implement and monitor. Is what we intended to happen happening? And if not, what changes do we need to make? Recycle and repeat. That's the work that has to be done in a broader context. Luckily in water, as compared to climate change, you have a somewhat unique operating unit where you can get your hands around trying to address the change. It's a physical parameter, it's a physical boundary that you can start to operate change within.
Peter, what's your observation when you listen to the Ecolab and General Mills stories, and you think about overall businesses and where they are in the continuum of fulfilling businesses' responsibilities? What kind of observations do you have about that, please?
Sure. Actually, Ron and I were talking about this a little bit earlier in another context. There's a spectrum of players in any industry, corporate sector, environmental community, politicians. There's a spectrum of good players and bad players. And the good players in the business world who are thinking about water are doing the kinds of things you're hearing about here. They're not thinking about corporate social responsibility as something peripheral, but as something central. They're thinking about how to integrate it into their fundamental operations. They're thinking about their role as stewards in a broad community sense. And those good players aren't everyone, but those good players set standards that the rest of the industry ultimately will follow, I believe. They're going to raise the awareness of the importance. They're the ones who are going to weather the risks better when there's a drought or when there's a community crisis. They're the ones that are going to have lessons for the rest of the industry. And I think that this world is changing really quickly. It's a complicated one. The supply chain issue is an incredibly complicated one. What is the responsibility of a company whose 95% of their water footprint is not their own operations, but the water required to grow the feedstock that comes into their system? They don't control the farmers. They don't, they buy stuff on an open market. What is their responsibility? That's a difficult question, but it's one that some of the companies here and some of the companies we've been working with are starting to think about. And it's changing very quickly.
And Jerry, staying on that notion for a moment, working with supply chain, how do you engage them in the conversation about water and sustainability? And how do you make sure they're part of the solution that you're trying to develop?
Yeah, so we're blessed to have a supply chain organization that really cares about this internally, and we've had goals around our own water efficiency within our own facilities for some 10 years. But it becomes very clear very quickly that, particularly when 99% of the water footprint is upstream of you, that's not nearly enough for you to continue to operate well, or for the communities and the consumers that depend on that same water to have the kind of healthy quality lives that they need. And so working with suppliers, our approach is to take suppliers with us on this journey. Anybody who's in agriculture gets this very quickly, particularly when you engage directly with the farmers, because farmers get this in spades. If you talk to some of the vegetable farmers down in Irapuato, they will tell you, my father, when he drilled the first well to get to water, had to go down 100 to 200 feet. I'm having to go down more than 1,000 feet to get that water. So they will tell you, and that means they're using more energy to get it out. They're more concerned about the quality that's coming out. So they get this in serious detail. And that process of, it doesn't take long to bring a supplier to that conversation and for them to get it.
We're going to open it up to the audience for questions in just a moment. But a question for you, Emilio, and that is, why is this important to Ecolab more specifically? You talk broadly about businesses' responsibility, but perhaps you could talk a little bit about Ecolab.
Sure. So as you mentioned in my way too long introduction, so I need to shorten my introduction. I already got that as a mental note, by the way. I would say that when you think about Ecolab and our strategic business in terms of looking at the impact we have around sustainability, we talk about sustainability being core to our business mainly because when you serve 1.3 million customer locations in over 40 different industries, some of the ones mentioned today, and as well as General Mills being one of our customers, by the way, you start to think about the impact that we can have by reducing water 1%, 5%, 10% across that population versus what we do within our own operations. We do quite a bit within our own operations. We follow some of the principles that Jerry talked about a minute ago. But we really are driving impact where we believe it's most significant in the world, which is these 1.3 million locations to really develop technologies and expertise to help them manage this water resource and also spread the word that it's not only about conservation, it's about stewardship. And that's really a big driver for us. We've been involved in an organization called the Alliance for Water Stewardship. It's an organization that has developed these international standards, and General Mills has also been a founder of this organization. Last year in Lima, Peru, they launched these international standards. They're now available. There are a set of principles, and it's important, as Peter talked about them, in terms of how we leverage these principles to really drive collective action. And I think that for us, we have 2 facilities in California, 2 manufacturing facilities that have adopted the standards. They're in the LA basin. According to the governor's mandate now, we know that there's a 25% reduction that's spread over the state, so we're working toward that reduction. Taichung, China, we have a facility. We've also adopted the standards there. So we're looking at assessing our own footprint and really identifying where we have the most risk and really driving these type of stewardship principles there.
Sure, thank you. One question before we open it up to the audience. You both occupy the role of sustainability officer inside of your organization. We've got a number of students that are getting ready to graduate, and they're thinking about careers, as well as the kind of organization they will work for. Can you tell us a little bit about this role of sustainability officer, and is that a relatively recent phenomena, and is there a career path one takes to get there? Perhaps you could start, Jerry.
Yeah, sure. So it is a relatively recent phenomenon within corporations, and I view the role as really trying to drive the integration of these externalities into the business process. So we're not a sustainability company. We don't sell or make sustainability. We're a food company that needs to be sustainable. So our mission is to drive this into the everyday decision process and to make it as simple for the businesses as possible. The best thing I say to anybody who's interested in a career in sustainability is go do work in a core function to a corporation, because you will see how the corporation thinks about it and you will see how these issues have applicability to it. The world doesn't need thousands of sustainability officers. They need thousands of marketers and supply chain people and finance people and R&D people and engineers who understand the challenges of sustainability and bake it into the everyday decision of corporations.
Thank you. Emilio?
I'll just add that there are a number of areas that we touch in this role that Jerry and I have within the companies, and that is regulatory, there's RD&E, there's research, there's legal, there's SH&E, and on and on and on. So our role is so diverse. And so to Jerry's point about having a core foundation from an educational perspective and then a career that knows the company across all these different areas is so critical. And so, I have 31 years with the combined companies, Ecolab and Nalco, that came together. So I have, that type of exposure to these different areas that allows me to provide the right type of insight that we need for this role. And so I really urge a lot of people, as they talk about going into a sustainability role, to really get that foundation and then really hone your skills in a company and really try to get as horizontal as possible, as opposed to everyone trying to go vertical.
Sure, and two themes I'm hearing. One is to get the foundation, but the other is building collaborations then across the organization. You don't do it alone. You have to really work with, facilitate awareness, and empower others to be able to do it. Great.
Yeah.
Well, let's open it up to the audience. We've got a couple of microphones. There's a question right over to your right, Doug. There.
Good afternoon. I'm Matthew Fitzmaurice. I work at a firm called Ecoloab Asset Management. We manage institutional capital. We buy companies, securities in companies that are solving for issues around water, ag, and energy. As part of the conversation today, you've raised some of the specter of the impetus for making good decisions around sustainability. And what I wondered if any of you or several of you would touch on the role that capitalism and economic self-interest plays in making decisions around sustainability. Our observation is that advocacy, philanthropy, and policy will not get us to where we need to go. These decisions need to come from a viewpoint of economic self-interest, which historically might have been viewed as opposite of or in opposition to sustainability. If anyone would be interested in touching on that, if the question makes any sense. Thanks.
Can I start? Tell me if I veer too far off your question, but it's a great question. And I would say, bringing it back to the topic today of water scarcity, in my opening comments related to the value of water around the world, the question was, why isn't more done to reduce water use in the private sector? And so water is undervalued. And so this goes back to your point about, is the internal business case there to drive that type of thinking? And so I really believe that investing more into the capability and the tools and the philosophy of how we look at water reduction differently by assessing these risks, because at the fundamental core level, that all the we think of the private sector, that they're business people at the fundamental level, and they need to be able to make that case that if you can't monetize something, you can't manage it. And if you can't manage it, it becomes really difficult for you to take those steps to reduce water use. And so one of the things that we at Ecolab has been working with an organization by the name of True Cost is to really drive a way to monetize risk by using a publicly available tool that we developed that accounts for the benefits that water provides a water user that today is not accounted for in the water bill. And so it's thinking about things like groundwater recharge, it's thinking about recreational services, ecosystem services, and things that today aren't in the cost that we pay in terms of what comes out of the tap.
And so in the end, it's your selling pitch on what it is you do, because it's the ROI.
Yeah.
I want to weigh in on that, because I agree with that. And for example, the slide I put up about risk really was about economic risk, reputational risk, regulatory risk. The concern, of course, is economic. There were costs to Coca-Cola for failing to deal with the local community in India, ignoring the facts of the case for a moment, and they had to shut down a plant. That was an economic risk to them. Mm-hmm. But I also would argue we don't live in a purely economic world. We don't live in a purely capitalistic system, because it has serious limitations and flaws. And we have regulation, we have government oversight, especially of things like public goods, like environmental externalities. We have a Clean Water Act and a Clean Air Act precisely because pure market systems didn't account for, and we learned the consequences of their failure to account for, environmental problems. The human right to water is not an economic right. it's a human right. It's a moral and ethical and legal right. So what I would argue is, I think there's a very strong case for the economic approach to sustainability, that companies who really deal with this are going to have an economic advantage. But I don't make the argument only on that basis.
And maybe to tie those two things together, I think that those are absolutely both right, because humans do have a right and a need for water. And, you know, luckily we work in a business model where we have a real self-interest in our consumers doing well and being healthy and having healthy lives and having what they need, as well as customers, as well as growers on the other end of the spectrum. There's not only an economic but also moral, as Peter talked about, that work synergistically. They're not separate and they don't live in separate buckets. They work together.
Okay. Please.
This question is for Peter. What impact do you see international trade agreements like the currently being negotiated Trans-Pacific Partnership on countries' ability to address risks to our water and other natural resources?
That's a great question that I'm completely incompetent to answer. Obviously, there's been a lot of conversation about, in precisely this context, making sure that trade agreements, to some degree, incorporate social issues and environmental issues so that we're not worsening those problems in the interest purely of free trade. I don't know anything at all about the details of the Pacific Agreement that's being negotiated now. But that's been a challenge. It's a challenge because we want to open up markets. We want to move toward lower cost operations, but we also want to protect these other values. So maybe somebody else up here has a better answer to that, but I'm sure somebody else here has a better answer than mine.
Well, maybe just one derivative off of that question, Peter, and that is, what's the role of national governments, state governments in working together, and non-governmental organizations? Does that kind of collaboration exist, and what could be done to enhance that from your perspective?
Well, not in the context of this trade question, but in the broader context. I'm a big fan of these kinds of conversations. We're part of the Alliance for Water Stewardship, which is corporations, international NGOs, the UN. We're the science secretary for this UN CEO water mandate, but we're a nonprofit, small nonprofit research institute, and we work with the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Sierra Club on some issues. There's a real value to collaboration in certain contexts, and this is an area where collaboration and cooperation, I think, is likely to be much more effective than conflict and combativeness. So.
Okay, Doug, please.
Hi, I'm Dave Rappaport. I lead sustainability at Aveda. Thanks very much. It's been a great discussion, great presentation. I wanted to first just observe that a part of that economic conversation also gets to this issue of whether you can be long-term enough in your investments. And I'd like to commend both of the companies here, clearly looking far down into the future and making kind of brave long-term decisions to invest in changes that you're not going to see the economic benefits from for a long time. And that's something we need to figure out how to do more of, across the business sector. But the question that I wanted to ask is actually for Emilio. Many of the products that your company makes, as with mine, when you look at the life cycle water impacts, a lot of those are downstream in the users. And I wonder how you're thinking about the responsibility that Ecolab may have for the water use by those who use your products in washware and other items that are really water intensive in the use phase. Do you feel like you've got a responsibility there beyond the sort of broader programmatic things that you're doing to change water use as a society? Do you feel, are you beginning to work with equipment manufacturers? Are you doing education? Are you thinking about redesign of products that could use less water? It's certainly something we consider and grapple with, and it's not an easy set of questions to deal with. I mean, we sell a lot of shampoo.
Right.
You know, it's not necessarily in our interest to make less of it, even though we're, you know, there are dry shampoos and things out there. That's a long-term kind of transition. So I wonder how you're beginning to grapple with those kinds of downstream questions.
Sure. So let me begin by saying that CDP did a great study, the Carbon Disclosure Project, and they're also obviously very involved in this topic of water. And to Jerry's point about the number of organizations, I would consider, you know, there's 4 key categories. There's progressive companies, and it's probably the smallest percentage. Those are the companies that you're speaking of, that they're taking that extra step, looking at the future. There's the CSR companies. You know, corporate social responsibility is an important driver for them. There's what we'll call the optimizers. This goes back to, do I have a business case to make a decision? And then there, of course, the I want to comply. You know, so I just want to be able to do the very minimal to get there. The good news is that progressive group is growing. And I think you would agree, Peter.
Yeah.
So to your point about as Ecolab, what are we doing? It's a lot of it's being driven by these large multinational and national companies that we're starting to see more metrics around water use, water efficiency, around public goals, and we're seeing more of that. So this topic, when we come in and talking about solutions, it's become almost a pull now, less of a push. In fact, before I came here, I was having a conversation with 2 of our district managers that handle our customers in the 2 very critical areas in California, one in the Central Valley and one in Southern California. And given the governor's mandate, one of the things that they're seeing an uptick in is seminars on the concept of water, very similar to the topics we're talking about today. And this is, again, trying to build awareness in terms of what's happening and what are the steps that you can take to reduce water use, whether you're in a lodging property or you're in a food processing facility in the Central Valley where you know, water is obviously a big issue.
Can I add something about that? I think that was a really interesting question, yeah. And I want to add a piece to this. Think about washing machines for a minute. So in the old days, when you had a manufacturer made washing machines, they had to be reliable and they had to wash clothes really well. And they didn't care how much water they used or how much energy they used. That was, the consumer paid for that. It was a downstream thing. Now today, we have federal regulations on appliance efficiency standards that set standards for the amount of water an efficient washing machine is supposed to use, the amount of energy an efficient appliances use. We have Energy Star standards, we have Water Smart standards, they're labels. The smart manufacturers are still producing machines that are reliable and clean clothes well, but they're now bragging if their machines use less water and less energy than their competitors. It's become a component of it. But there was also a component of federal regulation. It was a spot where consistent standards had to be set. California set standards for appliances, and the manufacturers grumbled, and then more and more states set standards, and everybody started to grumble. And then the appliance manufacturer said, we just want one national standard, and they moved in that direction. So there is a role for government oversight and regulation in that kind of downstream point.
Hi, Sarah Lynch. Whether we need a national water policy or standards beyond what Department of Energy and EPA provide, my question is more in the space of what are the actions that government can take given that there's an inherently governmental role in managing these huge capital assets in wastewater, et cetera. What can the government do better in terms of providing incentives to help private business in disruptive technology and innovation that will help overcome some of these challenges, because we're behind. We're not doing nearly enough. And so what is that sweet spot in terms of government role in advancing technology?
Peter, you want to?
Me? So, this is always a delicate balancing act, the role of government versus the role of the corporate sector versus the role of the public interest sector. It's not an easy question to answer. Water is really often a local issue. I often get complaints that, our taxes are paying for our water. Our taxes aren't paying for our water systems. Our water bills are paying for our water systems. It's rare that the government actually invests, sometimes, but in the kinds of infrastructure. They tend to be local investments. Clear regulations. Where there's a need for regulations, clarity is important for the corporate sector. I shouldn't be answering this for the corporate sector, but clarity, appropriate intervention, permitting markets where markets are appropriate, and modifying markets where markets aren't working well. We're having this debate in California now about agricultural water deliveries, where the governments, federal and state and local, run water distribution systems. The water is owned by the people, really, and it's allocated among different users.
Jerry, do you have a thought there, please?
Yeah, I mean, there clearly is a role, and it was great to see California finally put a groundwater program into place this past year, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Peter and I were talking about this earlier, because it is very locally driven, but there's some standards. And clearly there's a role here. This is one that you can wrap your arms around. It is very measurable, it is very direct, and so there is clearly a role here that needs to be effective, it needs to be really efficient, because we're dealing with something that is a scarce resource, but that also consumers and a whole host of constituents are used to having at a very low price, and it needs to be proportionate. It needs everybody who plays in this space and uses water needs to chip in to help solve the solution. So if those three principles are kind of upheld, typically government water programs or interventions can be very effective.
Actually, here's one more example, and I'll just throw this out sort of as a question. There are countries around the world that don't have what we have, the Clean Water Act, that sets standards for industrial discharge. What is the role of a company working in one of those countries without clear standards in terms of their wastewater discharge? What standard should they be held to or hold themselves to? I think that's an area where the corporate sector probably would like a clear, and Jerry sort of said this, a clear, definitive standard that they have to meet, rather than try and figure that out.
Yeah,
ahead,
I would
please.
agree, and I think, in many industries, although not all, certainly in the food and bev sector, because the use of water is so tied to food safety in much of our operations, it's very rare that out of a food sector operation that the water that's being discharged is of less quality than what it was brought in. Oftentimes it's actually in much better shape, and particularly in developing countries where there may not be that same type of standard, just because of the nature of the business that you're in. The same would apply to pharmaceuticals. I'm guessing the same would apply in much of technology, because that water standard has to be so hard. I mean, you know this better than we do.
Yeah.
I mean,
No, I think that's absolutely right, and we see that actually in the state of California, where the connectivity of the water coming in, they expect it to be lower in the effluent, which is very difficult to do. So I want to go back, if I could, to the question about the incentives to drive water reduction. It's actually happening in the state of California. The mandate, if you've read the mandate, there's a provision that's being defined right now in terms of Peter talked about the 80% is agriculture when it comes to freshwater use that's not related to ecosystem. So let's put that aside, because the mandate doesn't really talk about agriculture as much. Let's talk about the 20% that's left. It's called urban, which is really urban and industry, okay? There are, one of the provisions in the mandate is about investing or setting up a fund to provide incentives for the urban piece to start to reduce water use. Some of that will be related to some of the, the washing machines and the more efficient appliances that we use at home. But then the other part of it is going to be targeting industry. And this will be opportunities for us to incentivize new thinking around the way we look at water. It doesn't necessarily have to be desalination. It could be other things. It could be smart technology. How do we optimize water use in cooling systems, which are, notorious for using a lot of water if they're not managed properly? So I really believe that it's starting to turn, and that we're starting to see more of that. California being, a leader, and that, maybe Nevada's next. Who's to say? But I just wanted to make sure that we talked about that.
I know that there are a few other questions, but we want to respect the time that we ask you to set aside. It is 6 o'clock. If you have questions, our panelists and speaker will be around, and we invite you to the reception immediately following this event. It's going to be downstairs in the atrium of the Terrence Murphy Hall. I'd like to first again thank our sponsors, CHS, General Mills, and Liberty Diversified International, as well as the Catherine B. Anderson Fund. Please join me in thanking them. I'd like to also thank our promotional partners, including the Environmental Initiative, Greater MSP, and Freshwater Society, for getting the word out among their networks. Special thanks to the Center for Ethical Business Cultures team who helped to pull this together. David Rodborn's in the back. He helped architect the whole program. Bob Shoemake, Doug Jondal, and you will see Judy Olson and Terry Hastings out making sure all of the details are attended to. So thank you very much to them as well, and especially to our keynote speaker, Peter Gleick, for being with us from California today, and for our panelists, Jerry Lynch, as well as Emilio Tenuta, for sharing their perspectives. Thank you all for being with us tonight. Okay, please join us in the reception in the atrium.
Thanks, Ron.
Yep, you bet. Thank you.
Pleasure meeting you.
Thank you. Same here, and I'm glad you were able to get through the traffic.